Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the connection between propaganda and epistemology. More specifically, to what extent are the terms Islamofascism and Islamophobia valid concepts? We're going to begin actually with the more recent term of the two, which is Islamofascism. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this word originated in the late 1980s, and very likely it originated from the political right as a critique of the authoritarianism of certain Islamic regimes in the Middle East. Now, to consider the validity of the term Islamofascism, let's first of all focus on fascism, and let's try to get a definition. There's a more general usage of the term fascism to refer to any kind of authoritarian government which has total control over commerce and the economy and industry, which brooks no opposition, and which generally has an element of aggressive nationalism to it. But there's also a more specific usage of the term fascism. And now is fascism, Nazism belong to a broader genus of statism. But if we contrast them with, say, communism and socialism involve public control over the means of production, whereas the more specific understanding of fascism and Nazism, and this is certainly true in the case of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, there is a certain recognition of private property. Individuals and groups are still allowed to own private property, but the use and disposal of all property is ultimately controlled by the government. So today we have our usual brilliant legal mind, James Valliant, to help us tackle these difficult terminological and philosophical questions. So James, let's begin with the definition of fascism. Which of the two definitions, the general one of authoritarianism, or the more specific one of a particular relationship between private individuals, the government, and property, which one do you think applies more to Islamic nations today?
Well, I think you'd need to break down the differences between fascism and communism to see which ones are more applicable in different contexts, because I think actually there's a similarity to both. The similarity with Islamic approaches to government, which are theocratic, and communism, let me start there, is that it's international. It isn't necessarily a specific nationalist group that Islam is after. They want a world. Any of these Islamic people who want a worldwide caliphate, boy, do they sound like international Marxists in one sense. They're looking for an international government. Muslims of the world unite. If I can paraphrase from Karl Marx, Muslims of the world unite. It's an international movement for some, and that makes it into communism. Classical Marxist-Leninist sense. Now, unlike communism, it does have some kind of nominal property rights. Now, these are collectivist property rights and very much regulated by the government. So in terms of its approach to economics, I would say it's probably more akin to fascism. That is to say, will allow private property, men, patriarchs of great families, emirs, sheikhs, people with titles, you see. So it's basically an old traditional view of pseudo property rights. But then again, it's the same under fascism. These are pseudo property rights when you get it to that point. So they believe in a nominal pseudo property right, which acknowledges basically a sort of elite aristocrat favoritism. In the case of Germany, it was certain pro-Nazi industries that were happy to work with the government. In the case of the Islamic world today, there are certain sheikhs, emirs, and oil, for example, that they're happy to have non-property rights for, no real property rights and no real capitalism. They are different. They're really literally different forms of socialism in that sense. The comparison to either is good because both fascism and communism are in effect mystical movements, irrational movements, collectivist movements rooted in a deep, deep kind of religiosity. Marxism famously as, a fall from grace, we need an apocalypse and there'll be a utopian future and we all need redemption from sins. The Marxist view of history is very fundamentally a religious view, modeled, mind you, on Abrahamic religions. But the best term, obviously, and the reason why I think in the 1980s the right opted for a term like Islamofascism as opposed to Islamotheocracy is because the right themselves don't want to associate religion with anything bad, when of course religion is the cause of it. It is, as I say, whether it's the case of I mean, Adolf Hitler saying that the Aryan race is superior and the German Volk should take over the world. That's a mystically based, obviously, and their connections with the occult are obvious. Their connections with mysticism are obvious. Not so obvious in the case of communists who claim to be Marxists, claim to be scientific materialists, but they're just as religious and mystically based. And so the problem here is mystical philosophy, collectivism that comes from mysticism. And in the case of Islam, it is directly theocratic in a way that the others are not. So I think the best term is Islamotheocracy, because that's what they're advocating. They're advocating a kind of medieval theocratic authoritarianism. The term Islamofascism, I think, is appropriate, though, because it's a kind of dictatorship, and it should be compared to the other kinds of totalitarianism. What goes on, for example, in Iran today is like totalitarianism. They brutally suppress any free speech. If you don't adhere to their mystically based collectivist moral code, a woman shows just a little bit of hair under her hijab, she disappears into an Iranian prison and dies. Thousands across the country protest. They are brutally put down. Hundreds of girls and women are arrested or executed. And that's just happened in Iran in the last few years. So they are totally a totalitarian state, but based on religion. And so I would call it Islamotheocracy. But there's no question about the relationship between the religion of Islam and the dictatorship that they call for in most of the Islamic world today.
James, I've heard some objectivists use the phrase Islamic totalitarianism or totalitarian Islam. Do you think that's a better expression than Islamofascism?
It's a form, I think theocracy, communism, and fascism are all forms of totalitarianism. So, yes, the term totalitarianism is the broader genus into which all of these, I think, are very easily subsumed. Yes, because it's a comprehensive ideology, it's one with an explicit philosophy. It grounds its justifications for oppression, violence, killing people for blasphemy, violating blasphemy laws. Oh, well, anti-Soviet laws when it was the Soviet Union, or anti-Nazi propaganda. If you were just to open your mouth to speak ill of Hitler or Stalin, of course, that would end you up dead. Similarly in Iran. But it's just a different philosophical base. But they've got a thorough philosophical base like those other monsters did. And it comes from that philosophical base. Make no mistake. In the West, we try so hard to not offend different religious and ethnic groups. And in the case of Islam, of course, it becomes complex because it's, when we fought the Nazis, it wasn't the German people we were fighting. When we fought the communists, it wasn't the Russian people, it was the Soviets, the Bolsheviks we were fighting. In this case, there are indeed less violent, more enlightened Muslims, no question about it. But there's also no question that Islam is the source. It is the Quran, it is the religion, it is the ideology of Islam that is the source of this totalitarianism. Explicitly, all you have to do is read the Quran and you can realize there's no room for personal freedom. Slavery is permitted, blasphemies get executed, etc., etc. So the Quran but this is true for most religions. In fact, every religion that I've ever studied has a political implication, and it's not one that favors individual freedom or rights either. In the case of Islam, it's particularly egregious, that's all.
Now let's move on to the second of our two terms that we're discussing today, which is Islamophobia. This is a much older term. It goes all the way back to the early 1920s, and it's been used increasingly in recent years. Let's begin with the following comparison. So when we talk about prejudice against Jews, we use the term anti-Semitism. But when people talk about prejudice against Muslims, they use the term Islamophobia, meaning an irrational fear of Islam. Well, what do you make of that comparison? And I ask because one intellectual who in the 1980s actually discussed this parallel between anti-Semitism on the one hand and Islamophobia on the other hand was Edward Said, who was a Palestinian intellectual, a very prominent intellectual. So what do
Yeah.
you make of the particular the structure of this concept, Islamophobia?
Well, it's a classic example of what Ayn Rand called psychologizing. I would urge people to read Ayn Rand's brilliant article. It was written in the Objectivist, published in the Objectivist magazine in the late 1968, I believe, called The Psychology of, either that or 69, The Psychology of Psychologizing. And there she very much criticizes turning a moral criticism into a psychological one, either using psychology either to excuse or to blame someone. Our emotions, our psychology are outside the realm of moral evaluation. And when you add a term like phobia to any term, what you're doing is you're saying to the other guy, you've got a psychological problem. You can't help it. You poor, dumb psychotic. And so you have a psychological problem if you're a critic of Islam. So all critics of Islam have a psychological problem. Now, I have no doubt there are bigots who simply because you're Muslim, they hate you. Well, that, of course, is a kind of collectivism, just like anti-Semitism is. To judge someone based on a group affiliation without knowing that individual, individuals are not statistics, they are individuals, is wrong. It's always wrong. To judge someone simply based on group affiliation with further analysis is a kind of collectivism. Ayn Rand also, great, this was 1963 article Ayn Rand wrote, racism. Racism is judging people based upon certain characteristics. If you are born Muslim and I just hate you, no matter what your religious affiliation, this is the truth for many anti-Semites, for example. They don't care whether you're a Reform Jew, Orthodox Jew, or converted to atheism. The same kind of ethnic hatred can and does exist. We have to distinguish that between a criticism of an ideology. No criticism of a religion, no criticism of an ideology can be racist. I'm going to say it full stop. I am anti-Judaism. I am anti-Hinduism. I've written a book about it. I'm particularly anti-Christianity. So if someone came along and said, Jim, you're Hindu phobic, or Jim, you're Christophobic, I would say, why are you psychologizing me that way? What, you think I have some particular psychological beef against Christians as such, or some psychological beef against Hindus as such? I do not. It is the ideology that I oppose. And my critique of the ideology of Christianity does not make me a bigot any more than my critique of the ideology of Islam make me a bigot. Let me go further. Insofar as any of these religions have been transformed by the secular Enlightenment of the West, let me repeat that. There is a philosophy that can water down and has successfully watered down mainline Christianity and Judaism, especially came out of America over the last 200 or 300 years. It's called the Enlightenment. Ideas alien to Abrahamic religion. Ideas totally alien. You will in the Torah, justification of slavery, calls for the executions of blasphemers, the executions of homosexuals. You will find in Christianity, not Christianity, does it improve on Judaism? Well, it gets rid of forced circumcision. It gets rid of kosher diet. Suppose those are steps in the right direction, but it goes in a very negative direction when it comes to self-defense. Turn the other cheek, love your enemy, submit to the evildoer. Those were negative developments on Judaism. So in some ways, Christianity is much worse than Judaism. In some ways, Christianity is a little better than Judaism. But the attempt, let's look, Judaism was actually only of before the 1940s, and Israel today is a mostly secular country. Its laws are not mostly grounded in the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law, when it was the law of the land, we have to go back to more than 2,000 years ago, though, was brutally enforced. 2,200 years ago, the Hasmoneans, we have evidence for legally enforcing Torah, Judea, after the Great Hanukkah Revolt. I oppose that. I oppose religious oppression of any kind, whether 2,200 years ago in Judea or the Christian. See, if I were to say to my leftist friends, you know something, I think Islam is a dangerous religion. Oh, well, you Islamophobe. Well, my left-wing friend, do you agree with the concept Christian national dangerous thing? Yes, fully agree that Christian nationalism is a dangerous thing, but any criticism of Islam, no, see, I think regard both as dangerous because I regard religion as the fundamental problem. And I think all of these religions, we talked about the difference between Christianity and Islam. Now, to my way of thinking, the Quran basically boils down to kill, 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 whereas the New Testament basically boils down to submit, submit, submit. Now, there's very little to choose to, from my perspective. Both are taking a rational view toward force and your opponents. Such irrationality necessarily is rooted, in my view, in a mystical collectivist approach, which is precisely what both religions take. So, to the extent Christianity has lost its political power in the West, it is a good thing. And that has happened over the last 300 years. You know, Christians in the 1600s were still torturing each other, burning each other at the stake. I mean, slightly variant, different Christians. You'd go after them and you try and wipe them out and torture them and burn them at the stake. There's very little to choose between today's most extreme Muslim countries and Christians more than 3 or 4 centuries ago. They're basically the same savages engaged in religious-based violence, trying to impose their religion by law. That is evil as such. So, can we compare religions? Yes. Can we compare them negatively and positively? Yes. Is criticizing a religion a form of racism or discrimination or a psychological illness like a phobia, which is obviously just a smear, just an absolute smear? So I would say that today, most Christians and most Jews are way better than most Muslims. And I am not making a statement about Europeans versus Arabs or Europeans versus Iranians at all. It has nothing to do with your race, your ethnic background. I would say that it has to do with the fact that Christianity has gone under an enlightenment in the last 2 or 3 years that has made them introduce these ideas of Western liberalism, which are utterly alien and at odds with the religious texts that they come from. There's nothing about freedom of religion or religious toleration or freedom of speech in any of these religious doctrines. These doctrines of religious toleration and free speech are the products of the age of reason and the Enlightenment. The Christian world couldn't even get to them until there was a huge rebirth of pagan ideas. Greek and Roman ideas. They couldn't get to it but for the bloody experience of Christian on Christian violence that they were absolutely sick of in a much better and a much more civilized context. That is to say, the age of reason and the age of enlightenment. So my answer is Western liberalism is the cure that can do the evil of these religions. And to the extent that Muslims have accepted Western liberalism, just as to the extent that Christians have accepted Western liberalism, they are better. To the extent that they are more closely adhere to their original faith, and precisely to the degree to which they adhere to their original faith, they actually advocate evil, collectivist evil, murder, theocracy, and that they all of these religions have in common.
There are a few points that you just raised which I'd say harken back to our previous discussions of Islam, its history, its ideology. Let's talk a little bit about, so you mentioned the Enlightenment, how the Enlightenment softened some of the worst elements of Judaism and Christianity. Is there something about the content of the ideas in Islam, its actual principles, religious philosophical principles, which makes it anti-Enlightenment in a way that's fundamentally different from Judaism and Christianity?
Well, my answer has to be no. Christianity, in a way, was just as irrational and evil and violent. Because while you're saying submit, 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 turn the other cheek, you're still saying getting the permission from the Pope the Spanish Inquisition or any other holy inquisitions
Yeah.
that need to torture and burn and whatever. So they are violent. Christians, for all their turn the other cheek stuff, are have to be. And you see, that's why the state and the church get exempted from the turn the other cheek thing as time goes by. They have to be. The church has to be able to wield aggressive force. The Christian king has to be able to wield aggressive force. Otherwise, we get it from Islam. All mysticism, faith and force are allies. When you set aside the only peaceful means of solving disputes between humans, when you set aside reason, and when you set aside the condition that makes reason, the operation of reason possible, political freedom, then you are necessarily in a world of mystical irrationality that demands force. Only violence can solve disputes when you've set aside reason and freedom. Faith, as Ayn Rand, another article I'd urge people to read, one of my favorites, Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World by Ayn Rand, which is now, 64 years old as a speech. But she's absolutely correct. Faith and force are inherent allies. They go hand in hand. When you discard reason, there is only clubs, guns, muscles that can solve the dispute. Reason and reason alone, and reason calls for freedom. And so the two, faith and force versus reason and freedom, are the essential issue. And what happened in the Enlightenment with thinkers like John Locke, right, and Montesquieu and other Voltaire and other thinkers who were advocating religious toleration was something radical and new on the face of this earth. Yes, they used Aristotelian natural law. Yes, they used Roman concepts of rights. Yes, I'll even give Christianity and Abrahamic religions in general some credit for saying that all souls are immortal before God. A pretty vague abstraction. It was only the experience of horrific religious violence all the way up to and through much of the 17th century, and the careful thinking of newly scientific minds that calmed down and were putting reason first, that could come up with ideas like individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. By the way, the same people that gave us religious tolerance in a political sense were the same people who gave us good arguments against slavery and such. And it's really only their arguments that turned it around for slavery in the civilized world. You'll notice how slavery persisted in the Islamic world all the way up into the 20th century. All the way up into the 20th century, still exists in some corners of the world. I think Islam could, because of the golden age that we spoke about, I think that there is at least a ledge on which Islam might improve. But really, at the end of the day, it has to be a rejection of religion. And in a fundamental sense, there was something that was rejected about Christianity 300 years ago by Christian thinkers. And they didn't even know that's what they were doing. They were rejecting some of the fundamental premises of their own Christian outlook. And that until and unless the same thing happens in the Islamic world, we are doomed to continued Islamofascism and theocracy. You see Turkey, like we say, going in a negative direction. And ultimately, it is the ideologically consistent ones who will win the battle. And that is why we have to turn to rational philosophers, advocates of reason and individualism, like Ayn Rand, whose articles I keep citing. She is really the answer. All religion is the enemy qua religion. And insofar as any of these religions can adopt Western liberal values, they will improve. And that's the only thing that will improve them. But at the end of the day, it is mysticism as such that must be rejected, because faith and force do go hand in hand.
Before I turn to my closing question, let's quickly check in with our producer, Daniel. Do we have any super chats, comments from our viewers at the moment?
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. And a super chat from Jeff. Thank you so much. Not one thing that's dominating the comment section right now is some people are saying that Islam is fundamentally different from Christianity specifically. So maybe if we can just comment a little bit more on this in the closing thoughts.
Sure, James. Let's
Right.
let that be our final question. For the fundamental difference between Islam on the one hand and the Judeo-Christian tradition on the other.
Everything that makes Christian society better today than Islamic culture was introduced to it in an alien from alien sources. Alien sources. They were not Christian sources. I'm sick of Christians saying that because Isaac Newton or Galileo were Christians, that means they get the credit for science. No, reason had to fight religion tooth and nail, and reason was the basic underpinning of religious tolerance and the doctrine of rights. Doctrines that Christians fought, and Christians at the time fought tooth and nail. The Catholic Church opposed the American Revolution. Christians were the one. People talk about Christians who opposed slavery. There were Christians who had, by the way, the better biblical arguments in favor of slavery. No, it was in spite of Christianity that any Enlightenment progress was made, not because of it. And ideas wholly alien to Christianity, which calls for slavery, which calls for absolute obedience to the state, which calls for turning the other cheek to your enemy and submitting to the evildoer. No, no, what Christianity gave us was the Dark Ages. And it was funny how it took 1,700 years of Christianity before individual rights occurred to a Christian. And it occurred to those Christians despite the opposition of Christians all around them. Kings still claiming the divine right of kings based on Romans 13 and so forth. No, 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 no. It was Aristotle. It was reason. It was scientific thinking. It was the horrific experience of Christians being at each other's throats for century after century that gave us the Enlightenment and a new approach to all this. It was not Christianity. Although, what gives people the idea that that's the case is that many, many Christian theologians have so altered the original meaning and text. Today, you go to a church and it's more like a psychotherapy session. They're not telling you fire and brimstone and you're going to go cast into hell if you don't believe exactly what we believe. They're not telling you that blasphemies are the unforgivable sin against God anymore. No, 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 no. In fact, they don't even emphasize that hell like they once did. No, Christianity has come off its high horse and changed utterly. And when you've got Christian theologians in America saying that material prosperity is your divine right, obviously they're not aware of the pro-poverty ideas of the New Testament from which they are light years away from. So American Christianity is hardly Christianity based on historical standards, my friends. And it's only been the infusion of contemporary Enlightenment ideas that's made the difference. So I strongly disagree. And therefore, it gives me some hope. I have met Muslims who are liberal, who've embraced liberal ideas to the extent Christians have as Christians. But Christianity and Islam both get in the way.
Well said. Well said. Well, James, as always, thank you very much for your historical and philosophical insights. Thank you to our viewers. And just a reminder, make sure you stick around for the reality show, which is starting in just a couple of minutes. Daniel, any final news or announcements before we sign off?
No more super chats. We have the reality show coming up. We'll be talking about Iran's Lebanese human shields. So that's in just a couple of minutes. So make sure to watch that. The link is in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, James. Thanks to you, our viewers. Look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you all. Be well.